share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Excellent, thank you so much. So I'm Holly Reynolds. I am Senior Product Designer on the Plan team, specifically focused on the project management group. And today I'm going to share with you about a recent issue I worked on, collaborating heavily with the Create group regarding simplifying resolvable comments. I want to actually kick this off initially by saying this one relates a little bit more obviously to code review, but I was initially tagged in it because it does address comments, and I think that the user was thinking that comments were associated with issues, and so issues must be project management, and I think that's kind of how it landed in my lap initially. But Pedro and I talked about it, and he said if I had the bandwidth to take it, he was comfortable with my doing so. I talked about it with my PM and with my UX manager, and it seemed like something that could potentially impact issues down the road. So we decided to take ownership and move forward, of course, with a lot of collaboration with Pedro and his team as well. So when doing reviews on MRs, the user expressed that their main use case was to create a discussion. But when creating a discussion in MRs, we have a dual purpose button, which is shown here in this example, for creating a comment or starting a thread. The default state is to create a single comment. So because the user wanted to create a new discussion or thread more often than a single comment, they were asking if we could just flip the default state of that button to start thread, as the current default state caused them to frequently find themselves accidentally creating the wrong type of comment for their need and having to delete that and start over. So by default, it would have this comment, single comment option selected. People would accidentally just hit that when creating a new comment, but what they really wanted was the ability to create a thread. At first glance, this kind of button flip default state seemed like a simple, boring solution and seemed kind of like the best way to go. However, I dug a little bit deeper and realized it wasn't quite that easy. So code reviews and conversations are really kind of two separate concepts that are very closely tied together in the MR UI. And this creates a couple of challenges. The reason that the user wanted this button to default to starting a thread is because of the option to resolve that discussion as part of that review process. They don't have that option with a single comment. They have to actually create a thread to have that resolvable option. So it wasn't going to be quite as easy as just, flipping this button, because we had all of these other processes to consider. So internal discussions revealed that the dual purpose button was confusing to many users. Some didn't understand why we had both options, particularly engineers who primarily just wanted to have a way to start a discussion that could be resolvable. Also, in other cases, they were creating a comment, whether a thread or not. So the verbiage was kind of confusing too. They thought either way, I'm making a comment. So, why do I necessarily have to have two different options? There needs to be a better way to do this. So we realized we had an opportunity to further simplify the experience for the users. So Pedro, Gabe, Daniel Grusso, and a handful of wider GitLab community users and I heavily discussed this. If you go to the original issue, which has now been converted to an epic, you'll see a lot of collaboration about this particular problem. And we talked about removing the start thread option and then defaulting to comment, because they are creating a comment either way, to simplify the flow, but users would still need a way to make those items resolvable, that critical piece of functionality. And also sometimes they did in fact just want the ability to just start a single top level comment, but we were proposing the removal of this start thread option. So we wanted to be sure that we didn't lose discoverability of having the option to start the thread. So we decided to potentially offer a reply box on all top level comments, and I'll show an example of that here shortly. So one of the reasons we wanted to prioritize this was that it was a very popular issue. You can see some of the comments here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but people were just expressing a lot of frustration, even though it seemed like a really small thing. This problem was causing a lot of regular friction for engineers and code reviewers, primarily when conducting their day-to-day tasks. So we thought this seems like something that we can address that might be kind of a small thing that could potentially have a big impact on just this kind of day-to-day experience for a lot of our users. So as far as the process itself, again, a lot of collaboration in this particular process, collaborating with, again, people in Create, people in our plan team, and definitely a lot of users as part of the wider GitLab community. We discussed the possibility of having side-by-side buttons for reply and start thread when you're replying, in case users accidentally maybe created a reply and realized they wanted a new thread all along. We talked about removing the start thread button altogether and providing a make resolvable checkbox option for top level comments. Considered whether or not all comments should be resolvable or just top level comments, which interestingly, after doing some internal research, users seemed a bit split on this. Some felt that all comments should be allowable to be made resolvable, but some felt that just top level comments needed to qualify as that. We also talked about showing the reply box on all top level comments, again, to help with discoverability. If we're removing that start thread option, how can we ensure that users still realize that they can start a thread? There is the little chat icon, of course, and that isn't changing at all. But we were concerned that maybe we would lose some discoverability, so we wanted to explore other options there. And then simplifying the UI further by maybe removing some redundancy, specifically surrounding the author avatars. So again, this was some of the discussion, and I'll talk about how we address some of these kind of side points in just a moment. But to that point, there is an issue, I believe, out there where someone had said, I'm kind of tired of seeing myself every time I create a comment or every time I reply. I feel like I see my own picture so many times, and I know that I'm the one commenting or the one replying. So why do I need to see my own avatar? So this was something else as we were kind of addressing this comment box issue that we talked about maybe looking to improve on. And then, of course, we also wanted to consider how these decisions could affect issues and other issuable objects that used commenting within the product. So again, there were a lot of iterations surrounding the design. If you go to the original issue, which I've provided a link for here, you can see design management has several different ideas, including some of the ones I've just touched on and how we kind of iterated and collaborated on those. We talked again about replacing the existing resolve thread with a make resolvable. So currently you can do resolve thread, and it is a checkbox that falls below the comment box itself. We talked about maybe taking advantage of that positioning and having make resolvable there, but then there was the question of if you choose to make it resolvable, where do you then show the resolve thread? Do you swap the two? Do you add a separate checkbox off to the side? So we kind of went through some iterations surrounding that discussion. Again, also talked about separate buttons, for starting threads and comments and how to address that. And internally, I conducted 5 just quick interviews with engineers to kind of validate the primary expectations and needs of start thread versus comment buttons. All felt that top level comments should be resolvable, which was a little bit surprising to me. But they all felt that if you're posting a comment in a merge request, then it should be considered something that is part of this overall review process, at least a top level comment. So they all felt that those top level comments should be resolvable. Many expressed again a feeling that the dual purpose button was unnecessary. Several echoed the issue that the author's pains, or of the author's pains rather, of kind of accidentally hitting the wrong button because of the default state there. And again, they were divided on if all comments should be resolvable in threads as opposed to just that top level. So we got some really good insights from just talking with folks individually as to kind of where our starting point needed to be and what the larger problems were that we needed to address there. So there were a couple of things that we were striving to accomplish in terms of use cases. We wanted to improve the overall user experience by reducing the opportunity for user slips, which Nielsen's heuristics identifies as an unconscious error caused by inattention. So just people kind of doing that quick workflow every day and accidentally making that wrong selection. We wanted to reduce that opportunity, reduce friction in the code review process through a more clearly defined label in terms of the button labels, start thread versus comment versus reply when replying. So we talked about ways to add clarity to that. And then simplifying the UI by removing those unnecessary components, such as the author avatars when you're replying or creating a new comment. And we wanted to improve the overall user experience in terms of our business goal by simplifying the process of initiating and navigating the code review workflow. So again, because this workflow is so closely tied to the process of commenting, we kind of had to address both at the same time, even though this initially seemed like just a very simple button switch state configuration. There was actually a larger flow that we definitely needed to be considering, and I'm glad that we dove deeper into that as part of this. So for the MVC, we converted this to an epic and spawned off 3 separate initial issues as kind of starting points. The first was to have a make resolvable checkbox option when creating a new comment to the bottom of the comment box and when editing an existing top level comment. And I'll show an example of that in just a moment, as well as to change that dual purpose button of start thread and comment to just comment. They're just creating a comment either way. Whether or not they need to make it resolvable is now going to be a separate concept. And then secondly, to have a make resolvable checkbox option to that ellipsis dropdown menu so that, again, for discoverability, we can make it a little bit easier for users to be able to get to this at any point when they're kind of navigating these discussions. And then the third was to remove avatars for reply and new comment fields, again, to kind of simplify the UI and remove some of that redundancy that our users are experiencing. So just a few examples here of what those look like. In this case, we've got just kind of a new comment box. It doesn't have the avatar off to the side. Same with the reply box over here. Again, we would just remove those avatars. We also have this make resolvable checkbox here. This interestingly spawned off, again, a separate conversation about the structure of the comment box and whether or not we should perhaps consider moving attach file, perhaps up into this top level kind of tools section of the comment editor, as well as another issue that currently exists regarding this markdown and quick actions option and whether or not that needs to also be moved. In that case, we could potentially move this make resolvable over to the side. I have to admit, I don't necessarily love the placement of it here because I think that it kind of feels kind of smushed in there at the moment, but we had a lot of discussion around it and it seems like this is kind of the best place to start to get feedback on the value of this particular approach and then explore other ways and separate issues to kind of clean up this part of the UI. We also now have just the single comment box as well, as opposed to that dual comment box. So when you create a comment, you're creating a comment that also has the ability to be resolvable as well as to have a reply from the start. But you're still just creating one type of comment from the start with those options embedded. And then lastly, again, was to have this make resolvable checkbox option as part of that ellipsis drop-down menu. Again, just to make it a little bit easier for the users to get to that option and be able to make those items resolvable, without necessarily having to go into an edit view for those comments. So for the future, again, we talked about 4 issues, how we can, again, consider the dual purpose button in that particular case. We find that it doesn't necessarily add nearly the value in the case of issues because we don't have resolvable comments as it does for merge requests. However, we do want to talk about resolvable comments for issues. That is a future consideration. So we have started thinking through how we want to approach this in that particular scenario as well. And then revisiting again the design of the comments section, considering whether or not we should move attach file to a different place, whether or not there's a better place for this make resolvable concept, and if we can move that markdown and quick actions line to another place that might make a little bit more sense in terms of not interrupting the user's flow when they're submitting a new comment. So I would love any feedback, any questions that anyone might have, but otherwise, thank you so much for your time today.
I have some questions. You knew I
Sure.
would.
That's okay.
So let me start by saying I have also always wondered about the dual purpose comment button. It never made sense to me. So I'm excited to see you working on this. This is an excellent example of a feature enhancement where we have something in place. We're looking at, we're going, the experience of this just isn't what it needs to be. You've talked a lot about decluttering. And in the context of merge requests, that's a really top priority for us because we hear our users saying, you got to declutter these things. So Good focus. So are you tracking these as part of our Q4 OKR that's focused on SUS improvements?
So this is a good question because actually Gabe and I talked this morning about kind of what next steps are for this. Is this going to be plan or is this going to be create in terms of moving forward and kind of taking ownership from here? I would say that if it stays in plan's hands, yes, I think we definitely should. If it goes into create, I'm not sure how they want to handle that. I think last Gabe and I talked, we were going to try and see if create would want to take the actual engineering portion of this and kind of build out these options. But again, if it stays in our hands, yes, I think we definitely should, because I think it's a way that we are definitely striving to improve the user experience, remove friction, and improve the overall usability of this particular feature and workflow.
Awesome. That all makes sense. At the very least, make sure the feature enhancement label is on it so that even if it doesn't get counted in Q4, it gets counted going forward. Thank you.
Absolutely. Sure.
Okay, I'm going to break the fourth wall. The moderator has a question. What problem does resolvable comments for issues solve?
That is also a great question, and that's one that we have talked about a lot. Personally, we're not yet on the same page, I think, as to what the problem is that it resolves. I personally feel that resolvable comments should be something that is part of an approval type of workflow. And we don't necessarily have, I think, always a need for an approved process when it comes to issues. Some issues can just be an idea. They can just be, a collaboration opportunity, not necessarily something that I think needs a formal review and approval type of process. So I think that there needs to be a larger discussion first and foremost surrounding whether or not there's value in that. And if there is value in that, then I think that there could be a true value in having this resolvable option for issues. But whether or not that currently exists, I think still is outstanding as far as questions go.
Well, thank you. That makes sense.
Sure.
Christy.
One more from me. So you talked a lot about you did internal validation, which is a great place to start. Are you also going to do external validation, like with usertesting.com, something unmoderated and quick? That seems like the perfect application for something like this.
Yes, it does. And I have just gotten my access to the account. So yes, I think we definitely should be doing that. And it's just a nice, simple, quick prototype that I think we could get feedback on easily. So yeah, great question. And yes, we should do that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, Holly.
Thank you.